Welcome back to another episode of Pen to Pod. On today's episode, I talked with Harper Hawthorne, who is the author of Blood and Aether. Harper Hawthorne is an adult fantasy, romance, and speculative fiction author in love with telling dark, emotionally evocative, and character-driven tales. Her stories feature neurodivergent experiences, honest explorations of mental health, and queer normative worlds in her favored realms of fantasy. Though she was born and raised on the beaches of Los Angeles, California, she currently resides in the forests of the East Coast with her husband, her collie, and a demonic entity disguised in the form of a very large tuxedo cat. Book 1 of the 6-book epic dark fantasy romance saga of Blood and Aether was released on April 17th of 2024. This conversation with Harper was so special. We talked for almost 2 hours, which this seems to be a theme with my guests on the podcast, us talking for almost 2 hours, but it was a lot of fun. We talked about so many different topics, from how she manages the self-publishing process, a lot about the quilting method that she takes as opposed to identifying as a pantser or a plotter, as well as just world building, her unique universe and the magic system, and a lot about character exploration. We really dive into almost every facet of writing a book, and this was such a great conversation. I hope you guys take away as much from it as I did. You know, this title is Writing the Book of Your Heart with Harper Hawthorne because she talks about Of Blood and Aether being her heart book. And I really think a lot of us can resonate with that. You know, more and more people are writing books that they want to read, books that have themes and characters that mean a lot to them in their lives. And it's really cool to be able to see people who are out there publishing those very books of their heart. So I'll stop yapping now to all of you, and let's go listen to Harper yap about the book of her heart. Hope you all enjoy. The first thing I always ask anyone who comes on is because honestly, I'm selfishly interested, but it's really about where you live and how it's impacted the stories that you write. So I read in your bio, and you really specifically put that you were raised on the beaches of LA, but you currently reside in the forests of the East Coast, which is completely different locations. So I really wanted to open this up with talking about how you think where you have lived and where you live now impacts the stories that you write.
I love this question so much because I don't think I've ever really been asked that before. It's an interesting thought for me because obviously growing up in LA, in California, and specifically in like the beach cities of LA County, I feel a very natural like draw and affinity with the ocean. I've always been, water girly. I was a swimmer. I played water polo. So like I'm very drawn to the sea and lakes and, just large bodies of water in general. So far, they haven't played a huge role in my writing, but growing up, I was also very much a little forest girly too. Anytime I got the chance to like go up to Big Bear or like even like Topanga Canyon, like I've always been very into trees. I moved to the East Coast about like 5.5 years ago, almost 6 at this point, for work and my day job, of course. And I just fell even further in love with trees and forestry. There's so much greenery where pretty open about the fact that I live in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, and there's just so many greenways and so many natural forests and stuff. And I just felt right at home. So I feel like that ended up trickling into my writing more than anything else. Arkin, my FMC, is very much a forest girly through and through. She was born and raised in one. It's almost had a very literal impact on my writing as well, because there are quite a few local woods near me where I will literally just go out there and write. And I feel very inspired when I am out there, and I can really get into a very specific kind of creative headspace when I'm just out wandering the woods. I think that's probably the most impactful that where I've lived has been, because I think I probably wrote like probably at least a third of Blood and Aether from those woods, from my little secret corner where there's a little picnic table, and I would just bring out my notebook or my Freewrite and get to work.
I love that because I'm also on the East Coast-ish. I guess I'm in Cleveland. They say it's the Midwest, but if you look at the map, it is nowhere near the middle and it is not west. But I relate to being, a water girl and a forest girl. And I like that, it's impacted you, like you said, in where you write, which I think where you write has a big impact on your writing, subconsciously even. And so being able to be outside and write, I'm sure trickled down and helped the environment and the world building in your book. Like you said, Arkin is a forest girly, so I'm sure being in the woods has inspired that a lot.
Absolutely.
Also, you said you have a Freewrite, which I want to selfishly ask about because
Of
I have
course.
been influenced by a friend to purchase it. How do you like the Freewrite? Do you recommend it for people?
So I have the Traveler. They're not like the big typewriter one, but the portable, like little flippy guy that my husband likes to call my Fisher Price laptop. I personally really love it. It was absolutely an indulgence. I think that it is very pricey for what it is and what it offers, to be like perfectly candid. Arguably very overpriced, but it has paid off significantly for me because having the freedom to have a small device where I can type has been super helpful when obviously I go out in the woods. I think that's where I use it most, but it's also really helpful for me when I'm trying to get into a drafting state because of the small screen, the lack of, the ability to go tab out and check Instagram or check Twitter or something. So I've almost kind of created a bit of like what feels like a Pavlovian response for me at this point of like, it's easier for me to get into the drafting mindset on the Freewrite more often than not, just because it's like a small screen. There's not a lot of ability to edit, and I have a tendency to be an obnoxious perfectionist when I'm drafting. So with like the lack of ability to just kind of go up and change something and kind of forces me to just go with the flow, write it out, make notes to myself within the doc, and kind of draft dirtier, which helps me get past that like paralyzing perfectionism of like, oh God, wait, no, that paragraph wasn't right. I need to go back and fix that. And then I never actually make any progress.
I love that phrase, draft dirtier. I know everyone talks about writing that messy and not so great draft, but I really like putting it in that terminology. And I relate to you. I definitely am a perfectionist when it comes to writing. I have to stop myself from editing sentences when it's in the first draft. Outside of the Freewrite, when you're able to take that into the woods and like you said, it only shows you a couple lines per screen. Is there something that you found that helps to stop that when you're writing on your computer, or is there something you found that can help you overcome it, or do you just live with it?
So when I'm at home, sometimes I do use the Freewrite. I'll literally be at my desk, move my keyboard up and just put the Freewrite there and start working on that if I feel like I need to. There's also this really cool, I think it's free. It might be like cheap. There's this program on itch.io called StimuWrite that was made by a creator. I think her name is Eve Harms or something along those lines. And it's just a little word processor. It's not intended to be like a Word or a Google Docs. It's literally just a place to draft that's kind of supposed to be somewhat distraction free. And it was kind of designed with like neurodivergent minds in mind. So as you make progress on like your word count goal, it starts to give you like some like haptic feedback with like little emojis. And it also, you can like change the colors in the background and the themes. And it also lets like you play like different background noise or set like typewriter sound for when you're typing. I have found that tool really helps me when I'm in kind of a more distracted space, because it really does seem to be designed by somebody who probably has ADHD. I have ADHD. And that really kind of helps me when I'm just struggling with like a blank page. But sometimes when I like get in the zone, like I don't really have to use either of those, and I can just go ham in like my Google Doc. But more often than not, I'm either working in StimuWrite or my Freewrite, at least for first drafts. Editing is a whole nother story.
I literally just grabbed a Post-it note so I can write that down. I am a newly diagnosed adult ADHDer, and
Welcome to the
funny.
party.
Thank you. I feel like I should have known my whole life. Apparently, I'm a walking poster child. So everything you just said about that website sounds amazing to be able to write in. I think that is part of it. You know, being able to distract yourself, like you said, is a good component to get yourself to stop doing the perfectionist of tweaking of the sentences. Because if you allow yourself to get into that focus state, you're less likely to go back and try to like change every single word that you just wrote.
I recently took a writing course that was more like personality / like behavioral traits based than anything else. But something that like got brought up in that course that really kind of stuck with me is this idea that like it's very easy for our brains to want to distract ourselves like the moment that we hit something that's like, they called it essential pain, but it's also like, you know, just discomfort. Like you're second guessing yourself. You're not sure if that was the right sentence. And like, it's so easy, especially for folks with ADHD, to like that tiniest trigger, you might not even consciously recognize it, is all it takes for your brain to go, I want to look at this other thing. This got uncomfortable. And sometimes for me, like that discomfort is as simple as that sentence not hitting. So yeah, I think finding the right tools that like work for you and your brain can be so critical to like unlocking your best self creatively.
That's an interesting way of looking at it too, because writing is uncomfortable. It's super vulnerable. So when you write a bad sentence to you, it is kind of cringeworthy where it's like, oh, that was not good. And yeah, I guess I never thought about that, where my perfectionist tendencies may come out from that uncomfortable feeling with being vulnerable and knowing that the sentence I wrote was probably not the best, but we know we can edit it. So that's always something I have to remind myself. So before we get too carried away, because I could talk about drafting, editing, and all that forever, I'd love to go back to the beginning and just know, when did you first know you wanted to be a writer? Or are you someone who's always identified it that way?
This is also a fun question for me because it's interesting. I could easily say that like I've been a writer my whole life, because that's true. I've loved writing. I was an avid reader as a child, you know, befriending librarians and all that, and started writing like short stories, poetry, fiction from a pretty young age. I want to say like second and third grade. I actually went through my old external hard drive the other day and found some stories from like the early 2000s where I was just like, oh, they're all like corrupted and stuff. So I only got like bits and pieces of them, but had a bit of a moment when I found that. I was just like, oh my God, I've been writing for such a long time. And like I continued to write fiction and a lot of poetry, went through a songwriter stint a lot in middle school as well. And I think early high school. But then I kind of had this period of like my young adulthood where I didn't do a lot of creative writing for myself anymore. A lot of factors that went into that, a lot of it having to do with just challenging upbringing and struggles with mental health and all of that. But from I think like at least the middle of high school up until about 2.5 going on 3 years ago now, I didn't really do a lot of creative writing for myself. I did a lot of copywriting for jobs that I worked in after college and, you know, wrote papers in college. But I got away from fiction, and I also got away from reading for a while, where it was just something that like I always used to enjoy and kind of got lost in the throes of depression and other, you know, mental health stuff. And I came back to it in a place that like it still feels so recent for me, because I got the idea for Blood and Aether in December of 2021. So that was really when I started writing again. I had started to dabble in it in the months leading up to it, which I think kind of led to the whole big moment for me where I started to write some like background stories for D&D characters. I got really hooked on a video game and even like started to dip my toe into really self-indulgent fan fiction. But I can definitely say, like, I've been a writer all my life. I think it's always been in my heart and in my soul. But there was just this like period of my young adulthood where it got away from me for a while. And I don't know if I really fully identified as that. But now it's like the core of me again. So it's nice to come back to that.
Yeah, I can relate a lot to that too. I feel like I majored in creative writing, but after college I wasn't writing, I wasn't reading. I just kind of was living life, you know, doing the path that I thought I was supposed to by getting the big corporate jobs and focusing more on that than indulging in creative writing for myself. So I definitely relate to, yeah.
Like, I made my job my whole personality for a long time. And it was very damaging. And part of the writing process for me and part of, you know, kind of becoming an author was really healing a lot of that for myself, of letting myself prioritize and identify with something that is like my creative passion versus, you know, my contribution to a capitalistic society.
Yeah, that's really beautiful too. And so I have a couple questions from everything you just said. One, what was the video game that you got really into as a gamer myself?
Bear with me. There are a few video games that contributed to my inspiration, but the one that I was so fixated on that I started to write fan fiction about was Genshin Impact.
Okay, yeah. Love it.
Which is funny because for the longest time I poked fun at my friends who played that game and told myself I would never get into it. But then I got real hooked. It was a serious hyperfixation phase for me.
It's okay. I cannot throw stones at any video game obsession because I have become obsessed with Fortnite and it is damaging to my brand, to my identity.
Phenomenal.
Yes, so I understand. So, you know, I cannot throw stones. I'm a really big advocate, one, for video games because I think that it allows you to get involved with a story, which can be so helpful for creatives, but it also allows you to get out of your own head. So I love that kind of playing video games was one of these avenues that brought you back to creating for yourself because it probably did allow you to escape from that corporate life and from everything else going on in your life, and you can just, you know, focus on this and then allow the creative juices to flow, which is really cool.
What's so funny for that with me and too is like a flip switched when I kind of got the book idea and really started to dig into it, where like for the last 2.5 years since I kind of decided to take the book seriously, I haven't played a ton of video games. Like I got away from it for a while. And I kind of just recently started playing again, just realizing I need to find a little bit more balance between one job, second job, and, you know, finding time to relax. So I've been getting back into gaming more often. Unsurprisingly, I'm playing a lot of Genshin Impact right now, and also Final Fantasy XIV. But yeah, that was kind of the reason why I went back to it. Is like, I need to give myself permission to do this because it helps refill the creative well. And it was almost immediate that I kind of started to get ideas and juice flowing again once I like let myself immerse in a different world and just kind of live there for a little bit.
Yeah. And you said something that I think a lot of writers can resonate with as well. You know, we are writers because I think you said before, like writing has always been in your soul, even if you didn't identify with it for a couple years. And that's very common. But then when you do identify with it and we become obsessed with it and now we're pursuing it as a career, it does, thanks to, like you said, capitalistic society, become another job that we have to handle. And we need a break from that again. So I love that you're finding your way back to gaming and being able to refill your creative well, or then how else will we know what happens in your 6-book series?
Yes. Yeah, I think that was something that I was a little bit unprepared for, to be honest, was how my relationship with writing would change once I published, and how it kind of went from what was initially more of a hobby, a coping mechanism, an outlet, a distraction. Writing was a lot of things for me, like in the pre-publishing phase. And, you know, it is still a passion, it is still an outlet, it's still a lot of things, but once you're published and your book is out there and you're gaining a readership, like it really does become, you know, a job too. I mean, at least if that's what you want it to be. And for me, I like the goal is to eventually go full time. So it is like, you know, slowly building up to that is a job in and of itself.
Yeah. And I think there's so much nuance with self-publishing, but it's so great because you can have all the control and you get all the fulfillment from that. But then, like you're saying, you have all the control, so you now have all the decisions.
Yeah.
And it can be overwhelming in that way too, as much as it is fulfilling, it seems like.
Definitely. And I think the scales shift every now and again. Sometimes it's feeling a lot more overwhelming. Sometimes it's feeling a lot more fulfilling. But I will say that at least for me, I'm really grateful for the success that I've seen so far and the readers I've been able to connect with. Like, even on the worst days where it is very stressful and there's a lot of emails going back and forth, every day I get emails. Having readers who are enthusiastic and love the book, like there's truly nothing better than that for me. It's so fulfilling and so motivating that even on the worst days, even when the scale feels really weighted on more of the overwhelming side, like I always come back to just being so grateful for it.
I have to ask, what emails? I'm so curious. What are all the emails about?
Oh my goodness. Some of them are things that I cannot talk about yet, but I know, for example, one of the questions that I think that you had for me was talking about the Fabled Special Edition, for example. So, you know, so many emails to do with that of just back and forth with the publisher and going over contracts, going over art approvals, giving feedback on, you know, design direction, things like that. Emails with, you know, cover designers planning for the next book in the series, going back and forth on concepts for that, filling out lots of forms, all kind of things of that nature. I've gotten some inquiries about, you know, foreign rights publishing that I've responded to. No offers yet, but hey, we're fingers crossed. Though, as soon as I hear back from any of those, then it means it's time to start finding an agent. So that means more work for me. But yeah, a lot of other cool things are kind of happening in the background that I haven't quite announced yet that have required a lot of emails.
That's so exciting. Isn't it horrible that all the fun stuff requires emails? Emails are like the bane of my existence.
Same. It is very tiring, but at least a like second job, aka like indie author emails, those at least feel better than the work emails, like the day job emails.
Absolutely. And you have something to compare them to, right? Which is nice. You can be like, well, this one feels a little bit more exciting. Going into self-publishing, like you said, you're getting a ton of emails. You have all these inquiries for amazing partnerships. You have to manage your book designs and all of that happening. How do you keep yourself organized with everything you have to do to get a book from unpublished to published?
Oh boy. Poorly? So I think there's kind of two parts to that question of like the organization of like getting the book from point A to point B. That was a very dramatic and chaotic journey for me. As far as like just managing it all right now, I don't really have any like particular organizational systems. I am a list girly. I write myself a lot of lists. And I kind of split the way I refer to things in my head, which might make me sound minorly insane, but like when I'm writing to-do lists for my author things, it's like always like Harper to do. And like Harper is not my legal name. Surprise, folks. But in a way, it's like setting up like my Harper to-do list separate from my like to-do list that I have for like work or home stuff. Kind of helps me keep it all in one place, both in my mind and on paper. And for me, that helps me feel kind of more satisfied as I progress because I feel like I'm making progress towards the dream, like the goal, the like, you know, arguably number one priority in my life, which is now writing. So just keeping, you know, to-do lists. I have a lot of subfolders in my inbox and a lot of rules set up for where things auto nest themselves. Stuff like that helps. But as far as like the rest of the organization goes, I'm kind of still figuring that out, to be honest. I'm still figuring out what works best for me and how to balance everything, especially with just in the last few months has been a particularly intense period at my day job, which has left me arguably a little bit like mentally frazzled. So still figuring some of that out.
That makes total sense. I don't even know how you do it in general. You make it look effortless from your social media and how successful this first book has gone. So I'm not seeing any of the chaos behind the scenes. So I think you're doing something well.
Just know that somewhere I'm internally screaming, or potentially even externally screaming into a pillow from time to time.
It feels like that is the way of the author life. It feels like everyone's internally or externally screaming at some point in the journey.
True.
And what made you decide to take the self-publishing route? I know I always get a lot of viewer questions of which route should I take, traditional, self-publishing? And I always say it's so personal. So I'd love to know, what made you decide to go with self-publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing about me is that I'm a Virgo rising, which means I like to research. So when I first started writing, I wasn't really connected to any kind of writing community. I really just kind of had a book club where I started bouncing some of the ideas off of, and like my IRL friends, so to speak, dealing with me yapping nonstop about this story idea. But once I did kind of find my way into the writing community through Twitter, I started to learn more about the different routes that there were, and, learned a lot about folks who were self-publishing, folks who were traditional. I thought it was really interesting that it seemed like some of the authors that I really liked to read were hybrid. Like they did some indie stuff, they did some traditional stuff. I found when I was looking into options, the notion of querying sounded horrific to me for a variety of reasons. I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is a thing with ADHD of like, I am very sensitive to the notion of rejection. So the idea of like submitting my work and writing these pitches and just constantly putting it out there and just hearing stories about people who, were looking for agents for years. And then it's like, and then you go through like edits with your story and it's like the story gets purchased. And to me, that felt like a lot of loss of control as well, of like creative control over things, where I was just like, I can see myself trying that at some point in the future, but not with this book. This book has always been like, it is very much like this book and this series is the series of my heart. And I am too attached to the story, the characters, and what it means to me to kind of give up any element of that in order to sell it to a broader market. So I started to do a lot of research into self-publishing and trying to figure out, is this something that's actually viable these days? And once I learned more about self-publishing and how quote unquote easy it is, it's definitely not literally easy, but there are a lot of like tools and it is something that you can do on your own with, just some research and a good community by your side. That just felt like the right direction for me, particularly with this story, because I wanted full control. I wanted, full control of my cover, of my title, and ultimately very much the content of the story. Because I also knew that like with the way I had of Blood and Aether written and the way I planned the series to be written, there are things that are going to like, kind of defy or move away from like certain genre conventions. And I had also learned that, a lot of the times people do not want to buy series from a debut author. Like a lot of the times they want you to like make the book work as one book and then hope that you can sell it as a series later. There was no way that was going to happen with this story. So I was like, self-publishing seems like the obvious route to me. And thanks to all of that Virgo rising obsessive research, I was able to navigate it decently well. And no regrets so far. I still think I would like to be hybrid maybe one day, maybe query at some point, but definitely not with this story.
I'm glad you brought up astrology because I was going to ask you what your sign was when you said you were a water girly, I was wondering if you were a water sign also.
I am an air sign, but I'm an Aquarius, so water bearer. I am an Aquarius sun, Virgo rising, and a Leo moon.
Ooh, that's a good big 3.
Yeah, I kind of like it.
I love that. Yeah, that's really fun. That's great. All my favorite people are Aquarius, Leos, and Virgos. So
I love that. This is meant to be.
I know. And you called Of Blood and Aether a book of your heart, which I love when authors claim that story, or a story that we're talking about in particular, is the book of their heart, because you can see it even when you just said that sentence. Like, it definitely feels something very personal to you, which I love. So would you be able to pitch Of Blood and Aether to the listeners?
Oh boy, this was the one question that I saw and I was like, oh God. You would think at this point, having been published for a little over 4 months, maybe going on 5 at this point, that I would have kind of figured out the elevator pitch, but let me try my best here. So, Of Blood and Aether is a dark fantasy romance, the first in what will be a 6-book series that follows the story of 2 people who happen to live in this kind of magical arcane city called Sophrosine. One is a student who has just moved to the city to study arcana, magical arts, and the other is a guardsman for said city. He is the scouting and reconnaissance captain of the Elder Guard. And fate seems to be determined to keep pushing these 2 together, making them run into each other. And they both attempt to stay away from each other because both Arkin, our FMC, and Kieran, our male main character, have some pretty dangerous secrets, skeletons in their closet that make it difficult to really get close to people. But they are both very immediately drawn to each other and quickly find that they can't stay away. So the story is about their building relationship and friendship. Slow burn, friends to lovers. It's got dark prophecy, dangerous secrets, elemental magic, lots of mutual yearning, and plenty of angst sprinkled in there. Yeah, that was probably one of my more disorganized pitches, but at some point I'm going to figure out how to nail that.
I know I always ask people to pitch their book on the spot, and it's so rude of me because when people ask me about the book I'm writing, I completely lose train of thought. Like, my brain
I start to hear internet dial-up noises in my head.
It is the worst thing, and I know I do it, so I apologize. It's the worst thing to ask an author is, what is your book about? It's always like, I don't know.
It's because we're so close to it. I feel like it's it's so hard to try to condense it into a short blurb because everything about the story is important to us. But yeah, that is a good reminder for me to get better at that, though, because at some point I got to figure out how to pitch it in under a minute.
Yeah, and that's good insight too. I never thought about it that way. I like that we are just too close to the story, so we think everything's important, which is true, because now that I'm thinking about the way I've pitched my stories, I do throw out the most random facts, but in my head, I'm like, this is important for you all to know. But it's probably...
I'm a very intentional writer too, so I weave so much important things into even the first book that it's it is hard for me to determine what is actually the core of what a prospective reader wants to know versus what I know in the back of my head.
I like that phrase. Okay, intentional writer. That has my brain going. Now I have a lot of questions because I was going to ask if you are a pantser or a plotter, and I think this goes along with that then. So if you are an intentional writer, do you plot your stories before you write them, or did you pants this one?
So I heard this phrase in one of the writing discords I'm in, and it stuck with me. They called themselves a quilter, where they write kind of all over the place and come back and stitch it together. And for me, I think that's what has resonated most with me when I go from plotter, pantser. I've defined myself as a plantser before because it is a little bit of both. It's I'm still so fresh to this author thing in the grand scheme of things that I'm still figuring out my ideal processes. But what I'm finding is that I do like to plot. I have the entire series outlined. chapter by chapter, mind you. It is a 50,000 word document. That was a time. It was a time to be alive when I was writing those for a couple months. Because for me, I had to get that done before I published the first book, because I needed to know where the series was going and how long the series would have to be to encompass the story before I felt comfortable like putting book one into the world. Because I was like, well, what if I come up with something and I can't weave it back into book one? Like I gotta have it all mapped out. What I found later, though, especially these days as I'm like working on book two, is that it's actually rather difficult for me to write against an outline, because that's not what I did for book one at all. Book one, that drafting process was pure ADHD hyperfixation. It was me getting the idea and then just starting to write scenes that came to mind based on these three characters. And I ended up having chapters written that, were intended for book one, ones that I knew were going to have to be book two or book three, even some like really late game scenes that were just kind of brewing in my mind I started to write. And like my first draft of book one was kind of like a compilation of a lot of those scenes that I had kind of written separately and then began to start weaving them together. I did really enjoy that whole experience, and I can't say that I am against writing out of order. I think it works really well for me sometimes, though I'm trying to get more of a habit of writing in order now. That said, I do my best writing, I feel, when I'm pursuing the scenes that have sparked interest, that have kind of gotten my wheels turning. And sometimes that does mean kind of going all over the place within the story and then coming back and weaving it all together, like stitching it together like a quilt. And what I've found is that I really, really enjoy the weaving it together part. That part is really fun for me when I get to come up with scenes that help attach one thing to another, come up with like, certain sequencing. And then that gives me an idea of like what I can add to that scene that I had written before in order to make it flow. Like finding that flow state is like within the story itself is one of my favorite things as a writer. So definitely more of an in-between, I would say. I think the outline that I wrote, even though I probably won't follow it to the letter anymore, was still like instrumental for me in kind of figuring it out and mapping out the big picture in my mind and understanding the big pieces that I wanted to get to. I have discovered through like that writing course that I took and just a lot of like, trial and error that I'm also very like, discovery focused. I get momentum and interest in writing from what I discover as I'm writing it and the new things that I kind of come up with to incorporate. I could never be a full planner, but I could also never be a full pantser. So it's the quilting life that I think works best for me.
Love that quilting phrase. Never heard of that. You're teaching me a lot of phrases I'm about to add to my everyday writer vernacular. So thank you for that.
I love it.
People who are only listening did not get to see the way my jaw dropped when you said that you outlined chapter by chapter your entire series. I am simultaneously in awe and horrified for you because I don't know if I could have done that. I feel like I would have had a mental breakdown. That is impressive. Chapter by chapter is insane, and I love that. That's amazing.
I was having the time of my life, and one of the reasons that I kind of realized after the fact was like one of the reasons why I was really just going so hard on that is because all of that was discovery. All of that was me finding my momentum and the new bits and lore pieces. But it was very entertaining for like my critique partner and my writing circle and the folks around me while all of that was going on, because I had a very specific kind of like flow with it. I have like a whiteboard behind me that and I would go to the whiteboard first, and for the second through sixth book, I kind of loosely followed like the 5-act structure, and sometimes the 3-act structure, but like I would like have the structure kind of laid out on the whiteboard, and I would start like putting either Post-its or like just crazy, whiteboard notes, and just try to start figuring out, okay, what happens here, where's the midpoint, where's the denouement, and started like, mapping it out that way. And then once like my whiteboard was full and I kind of had the general outline of the story from like a structural framework part, that was when I would then go bring up the Google Docs and like go chapter by chapter in, okay, here's where it starts, here's where that goes. And for me, it's like I have the chapter, I have it listed what the POV character is, and then it's just bullet points. And it's usually anywhere from like 3 to 5 bullet points about what I want the scene to have. But the way that I did that outline was also very chaotic. The only way I was able to do it is because I wasn't really taking it super seriously. I wasn't trying to make it very organized. Like, I wrote my outline as if I was trying to entertain an audience of me, myself, and I. I was reading it last night, actually. So I was taking a bath, trying to catch up and remind myself of a few things that happened later on. And like, I just write really silly little things as I'm going to like entertain myself of like, Kieran is not having a cash money time right now. Kieran is not feeling fly like a G6. That is a verbatim quote from my outline. It's like little commentary like that helped, I think, just keep me going and kept me like motivated, because otherwise outlining just sounded so intimidating to me. But treating it as kind of both a place for me to like just word vomit out what I wanted to accomplish with the chapters, while also like, being quippy and funny for myself, just helped me not take it as seriously, which I think really lended itself to like the overall creativity that I was able to tap into as I was doing it. But that was another, definitely I would call hyperfixation period, because I'm pretty sure I did those outlines probably within the course of 2 months, 3 max.
In shock and awe. This is amazing. I love this for you.
Like, ADHD may be a pain in the ass, but sometimes it really can be a boon for me. I'm not a big fan of the whole like ADHD is my superpower thing, because of a variety of reasons, but like writing has helped me kind of fall in love with the way my brain works sometimes. There's a lot of times that my neurodivergency like works against me, but writing is one place where it actually serves me pretty well sometimes, I think.
I needed to hear that today. That is beautiful. I agree. I think that, yeah, people with ADHD can get into hyperfixation moments, and I definitely have those. I also have a mad board above me over here, and I have a stack of note cards for plotting. So I feel you on like needing the visual aspect for plotting as well. I really liked what you said though about a couple of things, because I think that's so true, that especially a lot of newer writers do find outlining intimidating, because so many things online, when you research or look for help, it is always like, you have to structure this way. You must do this thing. And outlining can feel big, scary, and a very logical, I feel like, part of the process. It feels like you're using a different part of the brain, but I like how you kind of flipped that. You talked about outlining as if it was your discovery process, which I think is a great mindset to have, because that is what it is. You are discovering what's going to happen in your book for the first time in that process, and being able to make it fun for yourself by, entering that Kieran is not having a cash money time right now is super good. It helps you not take it so seriously and helps you to get the job done in, I think, probably a faster way than looking at it so serious, because outlining is rough. It's rough.
Yeah. I really felt like, oh man, I'm never going to be the type that outlines. And it's like, now I love outlining. It's a fun part of my process. I just have to learn still kind of how to write against the outline and still find the discovery pieces that get exciting for me and like help me stay motivated and keep that momentum.
Have you found that the outline has changed then as you're writing book 2? You're talking about writing against it. Have you pushed against the outline a bit, or have you pretty much stayed within what you said?
Oh, I've pushed against it a lot. I've changed quite a lot. What I've found is that the outline helped me identify the crux of what needs to happen in the story and the general kind of placement and timing. But I think it's probably been a year since I did those outlines at this point. In that, that time frame, second guessed myself a lot. I questioned, do I really want to open on this prologue? Do I really want to, start with these POVs? When do I bring in this POV? Because the second book is going to introduce a third main character, third POV, and kind of figuring out how I wanted to balance those versus balancing the two POVs in the first book. A lot changed. And a lot is kind of continuing to change. But I have found that while I initially bristled against that and I was just like, oh my God, I spent so much time on these outlines. What was the point? I realized that the outlines and all of the work that I put into it served a purpose. It did so much for me in understanding the story and the series and where I'm going. And I realized I don't have to stick to the chapter by chapter ideas that I had. I think I'm producing a better story by straying from it because, again, it's like I'm finding the bits and pieces that I can weave in and adjust and change, or like, oh no, I actually want to bring an element of the story in a lot earlier. And all of those are kind of contributing to what like sparks that excitement for me. And ultimately, I feel like I write better when I'm excited about what I'm writing.
Yeah, that makes sense too. I think that happens with a lot of outlines. And I wanted to ask, because I think it's a good reminder too, for especially newer writers, that we are not bound to the outline that we set.
Yeah.
It's hard. I do feel like even just writing with an outline, because that's what I'm doing right now. And I do find myself being like, why did I do this to myself? Why did I back myself in this weird small corner? But you can always push against it. So I like that you're able to do that.
It's so easy to get caught in like the like sunk time fallacy of like, well, I spent all this time setting up this outline, I gotta follow it, or I spent all this time writing these first few chapters, I gotta use them. And that's one thing that I've really been working on challenging within myself lately is like, no, even if those chapters don't end up in the book, even if I nix that scene and rewrite it entirely to do something else, it's like writing those initial scenes served a purpose. I learned something from them. I, got words on the page. Everything is just, another step forward in becoming a better writer. And like, I think that has helped me a lot in like just reframing of like, it wasn't a waste of time. Writing those things, doing the outline, all of it served a purpose, but I don't need to let that like dedication to the time I spent then like bog me down and like prevent me from straying and getting more creative and doing different things.
The sunk cost fallacy is so real.
Ugh.
I'm glad that you spoke about it. It's the worst feeling. But I'm glad that you're pushing against it too, because like you said, even if you spent time writing those first couple chapters, you don't have to use it, which I know you said you kind of quilted your way through draft one, which is super cool. Was there a lot of stuff that you cut out when you finally quilted things together, or how many drafts did you ultimately do for book one?
Oh my God. So book one probably saw 7 or 8 drafts. It took me about 2 years, and I attribute a lot of those like early first drafts to just having absolutely no idea what I was doing. I wasn't even connected with like writing peers at the time. So like I was just doing my thing and writing what came to mind and organizing it in a variety of Google Docs and trying to track it in 1,000 different ways. But initially, when I wrote the story, I was trying to condense what essentially became the story of book one and book two into one. Like I was trying to take that whole like arc of book one and then tack on the next one, because I really wanted this third character in the picture because he was part of the original idea. Like the 3 main characters are very inextricably like tied together, and I felt like he had to be in the first book. So I was trying to make that story work that way. And I had some early readers from my book club who were willing to like read my messy little docs and got some feedback from them, iterated against like that version a couple times, and ultimately from like the feedback and just reading it myself, I realized this needs to be split into 2. Like I need to give the Arkin and Kieran relationship time to build and to really like let the reader see how they became friends and how close that bond was and how it was built because it's just, I realized it was so integral to the broader story. The series and like the book itself is like, it's all so very like character and relationships driven that I realized I needed to give more time for those relationships to develop. And then I think there's probably like 2 or 3 drafts of that. And then once I realized I needed to split it up, that's when like the next, I think, kind of 4 drafts ended up happening of just, okay, then I needed to expand the first book. I needed to create more scenes and develop more and give it more depth, give the world more depth. So I ended up going through, I think, 1 or 2 more drafts of like what really became the actual book 1. And then that eventually went to beta readers, and it kind of remained the same for a while there, but still went through a couple more phases of revisions and a lot of perfectionist reviews and edits. But I would say when it comes to like significant draft changes, probably about 7.
Yeah, that is a lot, but it's good to hear because I relate. I go through so many drafts. And I think just for our listeners who are newer writers, that it's going to take a couple drafts. It's usually going to take a couple drafts to kind of get to that final output and to reiterate everything you're trying to do, just maybe with a different spin this time. And like you said, okay, now I have the relationship piece down, but now it's time to focus on the world building a little bit more, making sure we bring that into focus, which of Blood and Aether is a high romantasy with dark undertones, which is a lot going on in a book, and it's all my favorite things. So love. But how did you go about world building? Because you have this, arcane magic, you have a magic university. There's so many elements. How did you keep all of this straight?
I love world building. Environments and magic systems have always been some of my favorite elements of the fiction that I consume. Very inspired by a lot of different video games in particular. Drew a lot of inspiration for some like lore and magic systems from things like, Genshin Impact, Elemental Magic, Final Fantasy XIV, The Witcher, and stuff like that. But also, I built my world around the characters. Once I figured out who these 3 characters were, who they were to each other, and like what their core personality elements were, the world kind of started to unfold in my mind in a way that like would best serve them and their stories. And also like their personality traits to an extent. I wanted Arkin to be a student of some sort, and I knew that her personality was going to be both very book smart and emotionally intelligent, and that kind of lent itself to the development of the magic system for me, where it was, it's a bit of science in a lot of ways. A lot of it started to kind of come together as a result of that quilting too, of like writing different parts of the story and letting myself explore and write off in what I knew would be different books, would bring up little bits and pieces that I would then be like, what's the lore on that? Like, what's the reasoning behind that? I love to know kind of a deeper reason behind why things happen, or how it plays out within the world or political systems. And I also, when I was first starting out, I had a friend of mine, one of my close friends, Matt, who we play in a D&D campaign together. I just started shooting things at him about this story at random. He had to deal with a lot of like heavy hyperfixation, but he contributed to it by just asking me a bunch of questions. He like asked me how my magic system worked. He asked me how, like deities and gods worked. And then that would put me on the spot to start thinking about it and kind of writing it up. And then I started to, sometimes write out like lore docs and kind of, all of those things would kind of trigger side tangents for me that ended up kind of creating what became a very robust and interconnected world, where now for me, it's like, you can ask me a question about like Sophrosine or Pyrrhus or any kind of element of the world, and it's so realized in my head at this point that like I can answer a lot of random things because I've thought about it so much. I have lived there in my mind and explored so much of it, just mentally taking the time to think it out, because I'm the type of person who needs to understand it to make it meaningful and to make it impact the characters. So there's a lot of lore and world building that like you don't even see on the page yet, but I just know, and in and of itself helps me make the things that you do see on page feel really, I think, like realized and cohesive.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about the magic system, which it
Mhm.
seems like I need to talk to you about my magic system because it seems like you have it all figured out, which I love. So I'd love to know, how does your magic system work for those who haven't read of Blood and Aether or who are going to after this interview? And how did you come up with it? Because it is so science-based. And like you said, you started with Arkin being a student. So that kind of gave you that funnel to start the magic system. How did it grow?
Yeah, so when I built my magic system, I kind of had to work backwards a little bit with the like broader lore that I had developed, because there's this immortal predecessor race um, called the Aetherborn, who have access to like what would be considered a more like classic pure type of magic. You know, they have access to every element and, you know, kind of have those like powers of creation, so to speak. But humans in this world are descendants from the Aetherborn, and only a very, very small percentage of them have what is called resonance, which is the ability to harness a single element. In this world, humans and Aetherborn alike have what's called aether in their body, which is a substance that is kind of like the lifeblood of the universe. It is what flows through the source and kind of powers all magic, and is presumed that the amount of aether that one has in their body as a human kind of dictates whether or not you become resonant and how strong you might be with your resonance. There are a lot of open theories as to like why a resonant human might resonate with like one particular element over the other, but it does seem to be at least a bit genetic, with, you know, certain resonances running in bloodlines, for example. So when resonant humans want to go and like hone their skills with their magic, they can go to a variety of schools, but the biggest one being the Arcane Studium, and then they become what is referred to as a conduit, and they study under kind of like the teaching of the Aetherborn to learn more complex magic. But even just a resonant human, like if you are resonant in water, like you can manipulate water, you can move it around, you can bring it from point A to point B. You know, Arkin is established as a light conduit, and she can, you know, manifest light from her fingertips. But the magic system itself, with these humans in particular, is like their resonance is just the manipulation of an existing element, whereas Arcana requires the conversion of one element to another. So Aether is omnidirectional, and it's like kind of fragmented out into, you know, there's fire aether, water aether, air aether, earth aether. All of that kind of comes together as pure aether, which no humans have the ability to wield, but the Aetherborn do. So the core of the magic system is it's elemental magic. And the more complex spell work is very much about like the conversion of one or multiple elements into another, like drawing from that elemental power to manifest a variety of different like kind of spell works that are all associated with like whatever element you're resonant with.
I love learning and talking about magic systems, even though I'm not the best at creating them. But what's really cool about your system is you have multiple restrictions while still allowing your characters to gain pretty great power, which I think is a key for a great magic system, is having those boundaries that drives the plot and the character arcs. And causes a lot of conflict, but then also they can still overcome what they need to with the power that they have. So that's really cool that you have these multiple restrictions, because you have either, you aren't born resonant, depending if it's genetic or not, open to theories, which I also love that there's multiple theories out there. So either you aren't born resonant, or you are, but you can't, like you said, kind of turn, I don't know, water into fire. That wouldn't happen, but you can't have something
you can't like
more.
draw from fire to create water where there was no water.
Right.
Like you have to learn how to do something like that as a resonant. But yeah, I found that kind of the restrictions almost made me more creative with like problem solving. I honestly couldn't tell you what initially drew me to wanting to do a elemental magic system, other than the fact that I am a sucker for any kind of like light and dark pairing, like light and shadow. Like I eat it up every time. So I think that's ultimately probably what inspired me to do that. But then as I kind of just started to dig deeper into it and figure it out, so to speak, the limitations that I was creating almost created more opportunities for me to like build and develop even more. And there are a lot of layers to the magic system, I will say. There are things that humans believe to be true that may or may not be. There are types of magic beyond what's already been established. I don't know. Magic systems are fun. For the longest time on my my smaller whiteboard behind me, I had like this whole like diagram drew of like the etheric spectrum and like where the elements fell on the spectrum, and like there's like a symbol that's referenced in the book, and like each of those like overlapping circles representing an element, and I had it all kind of drawn out for myself and mapped out. I'm a nerd, so
I love it. I love it. That's really, really cool. And I like that you said that the restrictions helped you be more creative, which is a cool way to also use the magic system. I don't know, it's very fascinating. Oh, you've been talking a lot about kind of throwing your ideas at friends and helping, get a sounding board, which I think is one of the best things you can do as a writer, is find your sounding boards to figure out what's working and what's not, because they're kind of a proxy for readers before you have them. Being newer to the writing scene, how did you build out your writing friends and this writing group? I get asked that all the time. So do you have any advice for people who are looking to do the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started dip my toe into the writing community, I found it first through Twitter. I kind of explored it a little bit on my personal Twitter account that's more associated like with my work things, and started poking around, saw like writing community hashtags and stuff like that, and I was like, that's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. I want to start poking around there. As I started to get more and more serious about writing this book and getting kind of feedback from my real life friends of like, oh, you could actually do this damn thing, then I was like, okay, I need to come up with a pen name and make like social accounts for it so I can claim them. And like once I figured the pen name out and made like social accounts, like a huge, like writing Twitter was a huge part of my induction into like the writing community. There were a variety of like pitch events and like weekly prompts that helped me find a lot of people kind of like me, especially like, queer, neurodivergent authors. Kind of over time, I slowly started to kind of find the pocket of writing Twitter where I felt most comfortable and started to kind of participate and, throw out some of those prompts and like do like reply to people who were doing similar prompts. I just kind of like dipped my toe in slowly but surely, and kind of for me it grew from there. I ended up meeting some of like my people who I consider like my best friends at this point. And at some point, one of the people that I followed on Twitter had shared a link to her Discord server, which was intended to be all about, writing and supporting one another. And I really lucked out because I think that was only the second Discord that I had ever joined related to writing, and like immediately like that felt like home. And I met so many people through that server specifically who I just really trusted, I vibed with. It was really scary early on because it's like when you're building community, when you're entering a new space, it's very intimidating, and it's super intimidating to want to like share your work with anyone. But I was so excited to be there that like, you know, I wanted to read other people's work. I wanted to like authentically engage with like what they were writing and just learning from the things that they were talking about. So just by being like a genuine human being and letting myself get a little bit vulnerable and start to share my work too, and, you know, start to just talk to people and ask questions because I was so fresh and so new. I was able to just kind of build a community over time that I started to feel really, really safe with. And ultimately, like, it was those communities, like the writing Twitter community in particular, that like really kind of got me from point A of like, this is a hobby, to point B, like, I am going to publish a book. So I think that like my best advice for folks who are like looking, find their community, is that writing and publishing is so overwhelming that it's easy to kind of get in the mindset of, I need to find people to learn from. I need to befriend this person because they seem like they know what they're doing and they're, you know, successful. I got to hit them up and learn from them. At least that is my experience. I think everybody is different, but really it's all about just authentically engaging, finding people who are writing and sharing, you know, snippets and content that like you read and you're like, oh my God, this is fire. Love this. Like, that's a banger. And just going in and being supportive and encouraging and authentic, like genuine. You will find your people by being yourself and like, and who you are, which again can be really scary on the internet. But, and perhaps this is luck, but I've found that the writing community online can be extremely welcoming and extremely kind and helpful. You know, not everybody is, and not everybody is gonna, you know, work in the same circles, but if you are sharing who you are authentically with the internet in these spaces and finding the people whose content and personalities that you fit with, just be real, just talk to folks. You know, look for opportunities to get to know people better. And if you see a random Discord writing group shared by someone who you think is really cool on Twitter and you're really nervous about joining it, maybe join it anyway. Do the scary thing, because sometimes it just might change your life. I really do think that joining that Discord server at like the time that I did, at the very least, it like elevated the trajectory of like how I was able to kind of get the book to a final published state, because I got so much support and hype and love from my friends in there that just really kept me going. It's intimidating, it's scary, especially as an artist, especially like, you know, making connections by sharing what you're writing and what you're working on, but it's also so much more fulfilling once you do find the people who are vibing with you and making those connections, because it's like, you know that they're in it because they love you as a person and they like your content and what you're writing. Like, that's how you find your people.
And the point about authenticity, I think, is true, like you said, for finding writing community and friends because you're excited about their work, they're excited about your work. I think it's true too about kind of everything we've been talking about today, of writing that book of your heart is about being authentic and vulnerable. And I think that's when your best writing shows up, is you being authentic to what you want to read. It sounds like the more we've talked, like you really set out and you're like, I'm going to write the book that I love. You said you love the light and dark shadow light pairing, you know, and you have that in the book, and you have this high fantasy with elements that you like from the video games you play, and it seems like possibly the D&D games that you play with friends. So that's really cool that, yeah, it comes down to authenticity, not just finding your readers and finding your writing community, but also to make your best writing, I think, is to try to be the most authentic and vulnerable. that you can beat.
I agree. And I don't think that necessarily has to be the case for everyone. I'm sure that there are folks who are writing things that they don't necessarily like feel very deeply and personally like connected to. And I respect the hell out of the people who can do that. Especially folks who are just like churning out tons of novels and stuff. Like, I'm sure those can't all be, you know, heart books. But for me and the kind of writer that I am, the kind of human that I am, like, I need that connection to be motivated and to work this hard. Like, at the end of the day, especially if anybody, you know, is considering the indie self-publishing route, it's hard. It is a lot of work. And what will carry you through is your love of what you're writing, your love of the story and the characters and how important they are to you. So I really do think that like loving your own work first and foremost can be a really crucial part to kind of finding your way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I think that's true for me too. At least right now I'm in a stage where I'm writing things that feel the most authentic to me and feel like heart books, which I hope we all get to write heart books.
I love that you also pointed out that like it seems like I was just like, I'm going to write the book that I want to read, because that's exactly what happened. Because all of this kind of happened for me in like a fever pitch when I had consumed a lot of like super inspiring content. I had watched a lot of shows. I got hit with the idea at the tail end of my 2-week winter break from work. I had also, I think, during COVID, when like a lot of people got back into reading, that was when I kind of started reading again and started reading a lot more fantasy romance. And, you know, reading those books, being disappointed by some of them, wanting more of this, more of that. Like, I really, you know, I realized it's like, I really want a fantasy romance that, you know, is really focused on the relationships of the character, but still has plot. Like, I want a balance of, you know, a robust high fantasy world with like just a lot of character focus and relationship building and internality from the characters. And I wanted a book that like, you know, leaned a little heavier into the spice once I got there. I wanted, you know, some of the books that I had been reading at the time, like for me, I was like, oh, it's like, it's so close, but it's like, and then the chapter's over. I'm like, that's all I get after all of that pining and yearning. Like, I need more than that. So I really did kind of set out to write the book that I wanted to read, that combined all of my favorite elements about the fiction that I was consuming.
I really think that makes the best stories, is when you do go at it from, I want to write the book that I want to read. Because, like we said, it feels, I don't know, I think it comes across in the writing. Like, I can tell when an author was really into the book that they were writing, and it makes me enjoy it so much more.
Totally.
Which I know we've been talking for a while. So as we dwindle this down, because as you can see, I can chat forever.
I am anything. A yapper as well, so it's not your fault.
I've found that to be the case with writers. It's funny because, you know, we range the gambit on obviously extrovert, introvert, but if you get writers talking about writing, we are all yappers to the core.
True. So true.
You know, you keep talking about Of Blood and Aether as a character-driven book, and it seems like you did so much character discovery before even starting to write. And I'd love to just hear you yap about the two main characters, at least that we see in this book, and how writing them was like.
Writing these two characters has been really interesting. You absolutely hit the nail on the head of like, I did a lot of character exploration very early on, and figuring out who these characters were and what made them tick, figuring out kind of their backstories and their, you know, critical moments in life. I wrote snippets of their pasts for themselves, or for myself. I did a lot of like looking up like character building prompts and writing prompts for, you know, X, Y, and Z, and then going through and trying to answer those for the characters until they kind of became so like fully realized in my brain that they like essentially felt like real people.
I'd love to know how you view Kieran and Arkin, and then what was writing their slow burn like?
Totally. So Arkin is my baby girl, is also an Aquarius. I joke when people ask about stuff like self-inserts that all three of the main characters of the series are essentially different parts of me. They all kind of represent something very kind of crucial and like integral to my own personality. So I connect with them all very deeply. I don't really think I necessarily intentionally set out to do this, but quickly found when I was writing Arkin that she is also ADHD and autistic like I am. And her neurodivergency and how that impacted her growing up had, a big impact on kind of how she navigates the world, how she sees herself. She grapples with anxiety, but is also very, charming and sweet. She gets along well with people pretty easily because she has kind of like studied human nature. She has felt other for a majority of her life, not feeling like she fully connects to the people that she's around. Like there's some integral piece of her that's like missing, that like just feels like she like doesn't necessarily feel like she's fully one of them, and has never really kind of felt that full connection to anybody, which I largely attribute to some of her neurodivergencies, though there are other factors at play, of course. But she's very clever, she's very book smart, but she's also fairly, perceptive and emotionally intelligent, which helps make her, fairly street smart as well. She is inherently a very curious person who is kind of just in love with the world around her, fascinated. Like she sees beauty in everything. She's the type of person who will stop in the middle of the walk to just stare at the night sky because it's so beautiful tonight that it floors her, and she wants to embrace that moment. She's the girl that picks up a bunch of little pebbles on her walks because something was shiny and pretty, and she wants to collect those, and appreciates the natural beauty of the world in a lot of ways. There are a lot of elements of myself, I would say, in Arkin, but there's also a lot of differences. Kieran, I would say, surprisingly, is like, he is the easiest character for me to write. He is like, I've said it before, I will never deny this, Kieran is my favorite character. He is my little Scorpio menace of a man who, like, he's very similar to Arkin in a lot of ways, but it's more subtle who Kieran presents himself to be on the surface and who Kieran is beneath the surface are kind of two very different things. He presents himself as this very charismatic, cocky, sexy and I know it type who, has like a devil may care attitude and is clever and witty and's got a silver tongue, can talk his way out of anything. But we find internally that he's a deeply haunted individual who's got a lot of trauma from his past, a lot of skeletons in his closet, and ultimately a lot of self-loathing, a lot of just really internalized darkness, so to speak. He, while cocky on the surface, is my little broody boy beneath. And what I like about Kieran too is that like all of what kind of haunts him comes from a similar place with Arkin, of like not feeling like you are who you're supposed to be, like having grown up feeling like you're, correct, not right, and kind of how that impacts an individual is something that I think is always kind of fascinating to me, because it's, very in line with my own experience as a young adult. But writing the two of them together was the time. It was very exciting, and I love these characters both so much that like it was very fulfilling in that way to just watch their friendship develop and grow and kind of keep unlocking little pieces of those connections with them, and like how they really kind of fall for each other. In a lot of ways it was also really healing though too, because it's like when you have these two characters who are very close to you and they have elements of your personality, in a way it's like you're writing parts of yourself falling in love with parts of yourself, and like it kind of created this like newfound appreciation of elements of my personality that maybe I previously, resented myself for, or, didn't like about myself, but like watching, Arkin fall in love with that element of Kieran or vice versa kind of shed some new light into aspects of that I thought was really interesting.
That is really cool. I've never even thought of that either. I do feel like writers self insert a lot subconsciously, if not consciously. And that's cool that you've recognized like all the three main characters that you're writing have these different elements of you, and you're able to kind of pull on that. Did you do any sort of writing exercises where you like threw them in a cafe in some random location to write them, or was it always scenes from the book?
When I first started and developing them, it was scenes from the book for the most part. And then once I started to, find my way into the writing community, that's when I started experiencing a lot more like prompts and started kind of discovering, and like, our writing server would do like questions of the day, asking, some stuff that was canon, but they would also ask, questions of just like, what does your character get at the gas station when they're on a road trip? And stuff like that. Answering those really helped me develop the characters forward. And I've also written a solid amount of like AU like fanfic content of them as well, which also helped explore. I have like a 50,000, I think going on 60,000 word fanfic of my own book, which is a high school AU of Arkin and Kieran.
Love.
That is my happy place. That is where I go when I just need fluff and sunshine, because it was a lot of fun. But I've also written like other, content like with my friends where we kind of have crossover AUs between our universes and our characters,
cool.
which was also like really fun explorations of the characters and kind of imagining them in different worlds and different situations. Honestly, I think it's really, really helpful for me as a creative, and like really figuring my characters out at another deeper level.
Yeah, that reminds me of, I was on Tumblr as a writer in high school, and it was a scary, strange time, but it was fun. There was like the whole like role playing community who took their own characters and like did just a ton of AU content with it. And I always think back to that time on the wild, wild west of the internet, because I feel like those exercises helped me a lot too. I love throwing, I always said my favorite one to do is putting all my characters in Disney World because it's such a chaotic environment. And I was
that.
like figuring out like, okay, which one of my characters was the planner? Like, who wants to be here? Bad. Who's like the Disney head? They have the Disney ears. They know all the rides that they want to go on. And then who's like getting dragged here? Who hates lines? Who's like, I literally could go home right now. Why do we spend all this money? It's just like, I don't know. It's always been fun for me.
I have absolutely done similar explorations with that. I think because of like a question of the day that the server did at one point, and I was, talking about how like Arkin loves the teacups. She absolutely drags Kieran to take her on the teacups and like is so excited in a theme park. But yeah, I really love doing stuff like that as well, because it also takes you out of your world sometimes and like lets you get looser with it and more, you have more freedom, which can just kind of refresh your brain a little bit. And there have absolutely been things that I've written for like these AUs that have changed the course of stuff in the book and the series itself for me, because I discovered something new. I was like, oh, that's a big part of her actually. Yep, I need to go back and change a few things.
Yeah. I like it too. I do think it helps to, like you said, like get out of the story, get out of your head. And it's the same thing we talked about with playing video games as a way to, re-up your creative well by taking your characters out of their world. You might see them in a different light, which is a cool experience. But I have to know, what does Kieran and Arkin get at the gas station when on a road trip?
Oh man, so Kieran in like modern AUs to me is absolutely Monster Zero Ultra guy. He
I was thinking that too.
usually goes for energy drinks, caffeine for sure. I think he is also a sour gummy worm appreciator, like sour candies, Sour Patch Kids probably would go for. Doesn't really tend to go for like chocolate or anything, but usually it's like it's going to be a Monster and a pack of some sour gummies of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what snacks that I had originally landed on for Arkin. I can see her being a big fan of Arizona iced tea. But I'm totally blanking on like what her snack of choice would be right now.
That's okay. She may be like, you know what? No snack. I'll steal some of yours.
And also, to be fair, with her kind of whole like ADHD ass, like she is a very like hyperfixation meal girly. So like the snack that she wants probably varies depending on her mood and what phase that she's in. Like one month it could be all about like the Twix and the Pringles, and another month she's actively stealing all of Kieran's gummies.
I love it. And you've honestly given me so many new words and phrases because I just wrote down sour gummy worm appreciator because I identify as a sour gummy worm appreciator. And I instantly was like, I want that as like a sticker, like sour gummy worm appreciator. Feels like a club that we belong to. I love it. So as we're winding down, because I know we've talked a lot. Since we were just talking about gas station snacks, I'd love to know your go-to comfort food.
Lately, for me, it has been birria tacos. Like I recently discovered them probably like maybe 9 months to a year ago, and then found a local place next to my husband's work that does them really, really well. So he can just pick them up on his way back from work. I literally have 2 of them downstairs waiting for me, but it absolutely does vary. It changes almost seasonally, I would say. But these days, birria tacos, and I am always ramen girly.
I love ramen and birria tacos. I have a local place that does ice cream in the summer, but then ramen in the winter.
Ooh.
And I'm like, ooh, you know me. You get me on a personal level. Yeah, it's really good ramen too. It's lovely. So for the listeners who now have heard more about Kieran and Arkin, where can they go get of Blood and Aether, and where can they follow you to find out more?
Of course. Of Blood and Aether is available on Amazon. It is also available in Kindle Unlimited. And I also offer signed copies on my Etsy, which comes with some fun character prints and stickers and such. You can find me on social media. My handle essentially everywhere is just at Harper Hawthorne. I have a newsletter via Substack, which is just harperhawthorne.substack.com. I have a fairly bare bones website that is just harperhawthorne.com. I am most active on Instagram and Threads. I'm also on Twitter and TikTok. I technically have a Blue Sky account that I never log into, but yeah, I think the most active you'll find me is Instagram these days.
Lovely. And I think if I remember correctly, I started following you through Twitter. And I have to say, how you talked about Twitter is so true. Like, Twitter was the glory years from 2020 to like 2022. It was hell and amazing at the same time. It felt like everyone who was writing was on Twitter. And
yeah.
I refuse to call it X. I will never say that.
It's very funny because I'm a social media manager by day, and I still can't, for the life of me, cannot bring myself to call it X. People will be like X, and I'm like, no. But yeah, I have to say that in like the recent changes over like the last year or so with the platform, it's been like low-key heartbreaking. Like it's the end of an era. I have moved away from actively using Twitter a lot lately because I just haven't had the time or energy, and also like just so many terrible changes to that platform happening that just make it more difficult to kind of connect. But I'm thankful that I have been able to like take a lot of the connections that I like found on writing Twitter and like find them in other places at least. But yeah, it's a bummer. I miss the good old days already, even if I was only in them for like, a year and a half.
I agree. I was on writing Twitter from like 2020 to 2022. And yeah, it was the good old days. I fondly think of them that way. Well, thank you so much for talking. We yapped for almost 2 hours about your writing process and publishing and this amazing book. So thank you for taking the time out of your day.
It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, everyone who's listening, go buy Of Blood and Aether. Go follow Harper on all socials, and I will see you next time. And that's a wrap on episode 7, if you can already believe it, of Pen to Pod. If you haven't already, I highly suggest going out and following Harper on socials, checking out her book Of Blood and Aether, and just showing her work some love. Speaking of showing some love, if you haven't followed the podcast yet, make sure to do so wherever you are listening. So if you're listening on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. And if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, also give a follow so you never miss when we drop a new interview. Next week will be another solo episode with me, where we will be talking about setting. Thank you again for listening to Pen to Pod. I wouldn't be doing this without all of you, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Bye, writers.